Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation, Second Continental Congress and Declaration of Independence. And this event is part of our series on the eve of the American Revolution, and it talks about individual events leading up to the creation of the Declaration of Independence, um, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. So my name is Allison, and I work for the St. Mary's County Library System. I'm kind of going to be facilitating tonight's presentation. Okay. Jim, are you ready?
I am.
Excellent.
Okay. There's huge amounts to talk about in this particular subject. I can't cover it all. Nobody could. Not in one night, not in 100 nights. However, you'll see, like on this first screen here, I like to squeeze little bits in where I can, little quotations. Uh, Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slavers. And this is William Pitt, one-time Prime Minister of Great Britain. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to be talking about events coming leading immediately preceding the Declaration, and then I'm going to take apart the Declaration of Independence itself. So just a few quick things. I've shown this slide before just to give you an idea of where we are in 17, let's say between 1770 and 1780. We're looking at nearly 3 million Americans, people living in the 13 colonies. And the population of England at the time is probably around 6.5 million, maybe 7 million, 8 million if you include Scotland and Wales. The point being that although the UK, the United Kingdom, was larger than us in terms of population, we were catching up really quickly. Just as sort of a refresher, we have what the colonists referred to as the Intolerable Acts. The British referred to as the Coercive Acts of 1774. And the passage of these acts by Parliament really set the stage for hostilities. After the Boston Tea Party, which again, there were a number of tea parties up and down the East Coast, the Boston one being the one we all know of as perhaps the largest. But as a result of that, Parliament closed the port of Boston. So nothing could come in by water. All trade to Massachusetts was moved a dozen miles or so up to north to Salem. And that meant it was very hard to get supplies into Boston, and of course, put a lot of people out of work. Sailors, stevedores, warehousemen, etc. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially installed a military governor, General Thomas Gage, who's also Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America. And it's basically martial law, although realistically, martial law in Massachusetts probably didn't extend much further than Boston and Charlestown. The rest of the state, the rest of the colony, was pretty much out of hand. The Administration of Justice Acts interfered with prosecuting people in the colony. The Quartering Act, of course, authorizing housing of British soldiers in unoccupied buildings. And the Quebec Act, which expanded the Canadian territory, which was not a democracy and which was very Catholic. And most of North America was very anti-Catholic, but extended their border down the Ohio River Valley, essentially blocking westward expansion of the many of the northern states or colonies. There are different sort of perspectives on all this, and I thought I'd throw a few at you. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the first prominent compiler of an English language dictionary, a very colorful character. He says, "Sir, they are a race of convicts and ought to be thankful for anything we allow them short of hanging." He was a man of strong opinions. At the same time, we get John Dickinson, initially from Pennsylvania, then representing Delaware. I cannot but pity a brave and generous nation thus plunged in misfortune by a few worthless persons. He's referring to Parliament and specifically the ministers. Everything may be attributed to the misrepresentations and mistakes of ministers, and universal peace be established throughout the British world only by the acknowledgement of the truth that a half dozen men are fools or knaves. And this is kind of important because it's still focused on Parliament. Anger is not yet directed at the king himself. And then from an outsider's perspective, Frederick the Great. It appears from all I hear that the ancient British spirit has almost entirely eclipsed itself, and that everything tends to a change in the form of government, so that the old constitution will exist only in the surface, and the nation in effect will be nearer slavery than in any preceding reign. What Frederick is saying here is that he recognizes, this is an argument that the colonists were making, that whatever Parliament could do to, say, Boston, it could just as easily do to Manchester. And the colonists were constantly trying to remind their brethren back in the UK that, you know, we're also British citizens. And so what they're doing to us, what Parliament's doing to us, they can do to you too. They were trying to get the support of the British people. Now, in terms of attitude, you could see a change. I thought this petition from the General Assembly of New York is interesting. I'm going to read it for you. Uh, think the word obsequious. We, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the General Assembly of the Colony of New York, beg leave most humbly to approach your Majesty. Inviolably attached to your royal person and government, to which we are bound by the strongest ties of duty and affection, and in the fullest assurance that your paternal care is extended over all your people, as well the inhabitants of the New World as those who flourish and are happy under your more immediate influence in the Old. We are emboldened to throw ourselves on your Majesty's feet, humble petitioners from the loyal colony of New York. Um, this is in March 1775. It's 5, 6 weeks before Lexington and Concord. On May 10th of 1775, and this is about 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met for the first time at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Uh, they produced two documents, both of which the Second Continental Congress ratified in early July 1775, so 1 year before the Declaration of Independence. The first one, mostly penned by John Dickinson, was referred to as the Olive Branch Petition. And it reads, part of it reads, Your Majesty's ministers, persevering in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense. Knowing to what violent resentments and incurable animosities civil discords are apt to exasperate and inflame the contending parties, we think ourselves required by indispensable obligations to Almighty God, to your Majesty, to our fellow subjects, and to ourselves, immediately to use all the means in our power, not incompatible with our safety, for stopping the further effusion of blood and for averting the impending calamities that threaten the British Empire. So this is part of a petition to King George to try to fix things. The last couple of pages of the signature page, I thought I'd throw this in there because on the left-hand side, you'll see prominently John Hancock, who famously on the Declaration of Independence, his name is up there, nice big letters, bigger than anybody else's, so that King George wouldn't need his glasses to read it. Well, apparently he signed stuff like that all the time. So the story about the Declaration is kind of apocryphal. And if you look carefully at this thing, you'll see Thomas Jefferson, you'll see other well-known figures. At the same time they produced that document to send to King George, they produced a second document also to send to the king, called a Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which you would think is kind of, contrast to the olive branch thing. But anyway, we are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers, again, not the king, but the ministers, or resistance by force. The latter is our choice. We have counted the cost of this contest and find nothing so dreadful as voluntary slavery. Honor, justice, and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. So they lay out, what the beef is. And again, Dr. Samuel Johnson's response to this is, we are told that the subjection of Americans may tend to the diminution of our own liberties, that is, Brits back in the UK, an event which none but very perspicacious politicians are able to foresee. If slavery be thus fatally contagious, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? 2 points I'd like to make here. There was a perspicacious politician who saw that what the Parliament was doing to Americans, they could do to their people back in the UK, and that was the aforementioned Frederick the Great. As far as the loudest yelps for liberty, who better than people who held slaves? Who knew the value of liberty and the cost of losing liberty better than those who enslaved other people? So Sam Johnson's wrong on this one. These are exactly the kind of people you'd expect to decry slavery. Both those documents were sent by way of Richard Penn from Pennsylvania, Arthur Lee from Virginia, to the court of St. James to deliver to the king. And this is their letter back to the Second Continental Congress in September 1775. On the 21st of last month, we sent to the Secretary of State for America a copy of the petition from the General Congress. And yesterday, the first moment that was permitted us, we presented to him the original, which his lordship promised to deliver to the king. We thought it our duty to press his lordship to obtain an answer, but we were told that his majesty did not receive it on the throne, and that as his majesty did not receive it on the throne, no answer would be given. To be clear, on the throne does not mean in his bathroom. On the throne is a phrase used for officially. Last month, I think it was King Charles III delivered an address to the Canadian Parliament from the throne. So what they're saying here is that, yeah, the king probably saw these things and read them, but he refused to accept them officially. And in fact, on August 23rd or 25th, just a week or two before this letter was written, King George III issued this statement that some of his colonies, some of his royal colonies in North America were in open and avowed rebellion. In effect, saying the colonies are in a rebellion, a state of war exists. So I want to give you some details of what's going on militarily at the same time, because it's not that Lexington conquered, one day, April 19th, 1775. They had the showdown, a bunch of people died, that was that. Until the Declaration was issued a year later. Not true at all. The Battle of Lexington and Concord actually continued after April 19th because all the militia who were chasing British soldiers back to Boston then laid siege to Boston. And that siege they kept in place for nearly a year. At the same time, militia forces drove up the Hudson River and captured the two British forts of Ticonderoga and Crown Point in May 1775. They're bloodless. Both facilities were under garrison, so I don't think any shots were even fired, much less blood spilled. And in June of 1775, the British succeeded in taking Bunker and Breed's Hills outside of Boston. Incredibly bloody, incredibly heavy losses, not much of a victory for the British. Back to the Hudson, we have Henry Knox. They captured at Ticonderoga. They had maybe one or both forts, but they captured the artillery, which is the reason they went up there in the first place. They captured 60 tons of heavy artillery and moved that artillery from the Hudson to Boston. 13 mortars, 2 howitzers, 40 cannon, including 12 and 20 pounders, and even one 24-pounder. So these are fairly large guns useful for laying siege. Uh, they arrived on January 24th. In March, they opened fire, and Sir William Howe, who commanded the troops in Boston, actually withdrew from Boston and via ship brought his troops and loyalists up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. 9,000 regular troops, 1,100 loyalists, and about 1,200 non-combatants. So basically, the siege of Boston was over. Knox brought the artillery, and it was very difficult, this winter, over the winter, carrying this stuff across the land without, being able to use ships to carry this stuff. Boston is the dark spot pretty much in the center, Charleston just to the north. There were militia, well, at this point, I guess you might be able to call them Continental Army installations all around this area. The red circles represent where those artillery were in place. Surrounding Boston, you'll notice these lines to the right, lower right-hand side of the map. Those are the shipping lanes that take vessels up to Boston. And you'll notice that there are two gun emplacements that basically govern that channel there. So the British were in a pretty tight place, and after shells started falling in Boston, Howe withdrew. In September 1775, George Washington issues this address to the people of Canada. And keep in mind that for a while, the American colonists had hoped Canada would join them. That they would be of the 14th colony to join, but they never did, and the probability of them ever doing so was pretty remote. But George Washington issued this address. This is part of it. The hand of tyranny has been arrested in its ravages, and the British arms, which have shone with so much splendor in every part of the globe, are now tarnished with disgrace and disappointment. Generals of approved experience who boasted of subduing this great continent find themselves circumscribed within the limits of a single city and its suburbs, that's Boston and Cambridge, suffering all the shame and distress of a siege, while the true-born sons of America, animated by the genuine principles of liberty and love of their country, with increasing union, firmness, and discipline, repel every attack and despise every danger. Washington goes on to say, people of Canada, I'm sending troops your way. Help them out. Don't fight them. Help, supply them. So those American troops do continue up the Hudson River, first to Fort St. John's, which they took again, I think, without a shot being fired. And then they occupied Montreal, also without any bloodshed. And that's in November 1775. But at the end of December 1775, their forces attack Montreal and are repelled with significant casualties. So here's a map on the left-hand side, a little hard to see because the print's small, but we have Crown Point, Fort Ticonderoga. We have Richard Montgomery under General Philip Schuyler's command going up the Hudson, taking St. John's, and then Montreal, and then up the St. Lawrence or down the St. Lawrence towards Quebec. At the same time, Washington sends Benedict Arnold up through Western Maine, up the Kennebec River, and then through Western Maine, also to Quebec to meet up with Montgomery. Washington and Arnold clearly did not know the state of the then didn't know Maine, Western Maine, because to me it's like one big wetland. You know, to try to get troops up there through the wilderness was just crazy. And Benedict Arnold ended up arriving with 600 very worn out, poorly supplied soldiers. They met up with Montgomery. They attacked Quebec. They were repelled and they laid siege until May the following year. But it was, by all accounts, a very unsuccessful siege. It just didn't work. They didn't have enough men to encircle Quebec and properly lay siege to it. After Boston, Washington went down to New York um, to try to protect New York from, and of course, the Hudson from the British. So he established a line of troops in Brooklyn under Israel Putnam. You see these blue rectangles to the left, and then also to the south with Sullivan, Washington himself, Chester. The problem is, and they're facing, you can see this group of four rectangles down here, British troops, six black rectangles down below. Those are Hessians, mercenaries. The problem is Long Island's an island, and Howe only had to sail a little further east, land his troops, and come up around behind Washington, flanked him. And that's what you see in the center of these six rectangles. That's Howe attacking. Washington had to beat it out of there, and that's where the Maryland line comes in, where Maryland militia, or I guess Continentals at this point, fought the rear guard for Washington and allowed his troops to get across the river to relative safety. There we go. On the right side, I know it looks like multicolored spaghetti, but this down here is Brooklyn. Those are the same placements that I showed. Oh, bugger that. In the previous slide. So Washington manages to cross the East River, go up Manhattan, turns around and takes on the British briefly, then heads on up to Westchester County, Yonkers, Westchester County. On the left-hand side, you can see that map, and you can see how he goes, the blue dashed line. He goes up the Hudson, um, quite a ways up to what, but it's now Bear Mountain, I guess, Park, and then comes down through New York, engages the British again in New Jersey, a couple of times, heads south, and then back up north into New Jersey for uh, his winter headquarters. So all that was going on. I mean, the battle in New York was in August. Well, this is going on August 1776. So the declaration had been signed some, what, 6 weeks earlier, 5, 6 weeks earlier. So the declaration itself, there are lots of images, lots of people painted, and there was nobody on the spot doing drawings or anything like a court reporter. So all these are I won't say fanciful, but they're uh, best guess as to what a scene looked like. This one shows Jefferson on the right, Franklin on the left, and John Adams in the middle. Actually left out two of the other guys who were on this committee to compose the Declaration, and being Roger Sherman from Connecticut, I think, and William Livingston from New York. But yeah, you look at this painting, there's all these scraps of paper on the ground, some books around, and doing some research and everything. Actually, a lot of this stuff was recycled material, some of which Jefferson had written earlier for the state of Virginia. And when you actually look at the Declaration of Independence, it's really a very short document. It's not like they spent, they wrote there's reams of paper on it. And then this one of several depictions, this one from 1819, Uh, John Trumbull was a very well-known portraitist and painter of historic scenes. I think this one hangs in the Capitol building. But here you see that committee of five, starting from the right, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, I think that's Roger Sherman. No, that's Livingston, Roger Sherman, and then John Adams presenting the draft to John Hancock and the Second Continental Congress. So I want to go through it. Not quite word for word, but we'll go through a lot of it. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Notice the U is not capitalized. It's the states of America that happen to be united. It is not a single entity. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. This is just loaded with stuff. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. This is effectively unheard of in the 18th century, at least 18th century Europe. You don't dissolve political bands. Polities are polities. You're part of a nation. That's that. What's this dissolving bit? This is new theory. And to assume among the powers of the earth separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Laws of nature allow you to become a nation amongst others. Nature's God, what is all this from? And most of you probably remember from your schooling that, we kind of talked about this, I don't know, elementary school, junior high, whatever. Um, but of the great philosophers that these people were reading, they're getting a lot of these ideas, and particularly the Scotsman John Locke. And then a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. Why the hell do they care what the opinions of mankind are? Well, one of the reasons is this. It's a document basically aimed at Frederick the Great again. We have the honor of enclosing the Declaration of the Independency of the United States of North America with the Articles of their Confederation, which we desire you to take the earliest opportunity of laying before His Majesty, the King of Prussia. At the same time, we wish he may be assured of the earnest desire of the United States to obtain his friendship, and by a free commerce to establish an intercourse between their distant countries. One of the needs of the Second Continental Congress is to establish essentially embassies throughout Western Europe, to establish trade relations because economically we need to maintain trade to bring in materials we needed, including weapons, and also wealth. Because the Continental Army, you pay these guys, not doing it for free. The next section has, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This, you can see from my caption there, is an article of faith. This isn't something to dispute. They're accepting it on faith. There's no real, you know, scientific evidence for this that all men are created equal. And in fact, this is that statement, that article of faith, that's drawn a fair amount of fire since it was written, because a number of the guys who signed off on this document were slaveholders. Uh, if you've seen the play or the musical or the film version of the musical 1776, there's this bit in there about John Adams saying, we need this section that Thomas Jefferson put in about slavery, and that the Southern delegates would not sign off on unless it was removed. In fact, I have the text. There we go. From 1776, John Adams. Mark me, Franklin, if we give in on this issue, posterity will never forgive us. Franklin responds, that's probably true, but we won't hear a thing. We'll be long gone. Besides, what would posterity think we were? Demigods? We're men, no more, no less, trying to get a nation started against greater odds than a more generous God would have allowed. First things first, John, independence, America. If we don't secure that, what difference will the rest make? And I mean, there's reason there. You know, if they didn't get the southern states to sign on to this thing, there would be no independence. Not that I'm making excuses. The next paragraph, this is what I call their theory of government, and it's government as a trust instrumentality of the people. That is, it's something that the people create to fulfill certain needs. That to secure these rights, these inalienable rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's a theory of government, essentially novel theory of government in the 18th century. It follows what I call a theory of revolution. You know, when, what is a revolution and when is it desirable to have one? Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. So this is their explanation. They then summarize. This is a very logical document. I mean, it's easy to just kind of read through it, but if you mentally put in subheadings like I've done here, it makes a lot of sense. The flow makes a lot of sense. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. You notice all of a sudden it's King George III who's the focus, no longer the ministers. They've changed their target from Parliament and its ministers to the king himself. And as I'll show you, the following things really make that clear, because most of the Declaration of Independence is actually a list of grievances, 27 of them. And I think about 18 of them, the king is specified. And I won't read all of these, but these first three are basically about, each of them begins with he, referring to King George. And it's about his interference with the governance of the colonies, with the passage and enforcement of laws. More he's. He's called legislative bodies at places unusual. And in fact, in other words, having the legislature meet in places not their capital, for instance, where all their records are kept, dissolving general assemblies, uh, and refusing to have new assemblies elected. You have to remember, the colonies since the very beginning essentially governed themselves. The UK had a very hands-off approach and the government invested little in the development of the American colonies. So by proroguing, that's the legal term for these assemblies, basically shutting them down, the colonies really had no government, and nobody to run things when they're closed. Get this He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, the American colonies relied, I mean, we since about 1700, our population was beginning to grow naturally through reproduction, but fairly slowly. The reason we had nearly 3 million people by 1776 was because of the large number of immigrants that came here. And so he was interfering with the movement of peoples here and with their naturalization so they can actually own land and participate in politics. Obstructed the administration of justice, made judges dependent on his will. What Parliament had done was they started paying the salaries of the judges and other British officials in the colonies. Prior to that, it was the colonial governments that raised money and paid those salaries. And because they paid those salaries, they could use it for leverage. It's like you either buckle under or, we withhold your pay. And what Great Britain did was it turned the table. It started paying those guys, so it had power over those officials. He erected a multitude of new offices. That's the customs people coming over to Boston and other cities, setting up shop, hiring all these people to inspect ships, and a lot of corruption going on, but basically referred to as swarms of officers to harass our people. Uh, Standing armies, particularly in Boston and New York. And this is something that carried over the Declaration and the early Republic periods where our new government was very suspicious of standing armies. Um, Making the military independent of civil power, they weren't responsible to the governors. Um, and Imposing laws and officials on colonial governments, quartering large bodies of armed troops. Again, that resulted in the New York legislature being prorogued for a while. They weren't allowed to do anything until they ponied up the money for quartering those troops. Uh, Protecting officials by shipping them back to the UK for trial where nobody could testify against them, for cutting off trade with all parts of the world. Well, that had been in place since the 17th century. We weren't supposed to be trading with anybody but Great Britain. And those laws sometimes were enforced more strongly than others. Number 17, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. It's really weird, given how much we know about the reasons for declaring independence, that this shows up so far down the list. Uh, Depriving benefits of trial by jury, transporting people back to the UK for pretended offenses, um, abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. This is specific. This is referring specifically to the Quebec Act, where they basically had a military, arbitrary government, very Catholic government, and enlarging its boundaries, preventing the northern colonies from extending westward. We're taking away our charters. Basically, the king could suspend charters or abolish them, since those charters came from the monarchy anyway. Suspending our legislatures, you know, uh, declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. That's at August 25th or 23rd, 1775 proclamation of King George III, saying his colonies are an open and avowed rebellion. Plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burned our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. Most of this has to do with Massachusetts. Transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries. This has to do with the Hessian mercenaries. And at first glance, it seems kind of weird. Why is the king of Great Britain going to the German states to hire mercenaries? Well, King George III was a Hanover. He was a German prince whose grandfather was invited by Parliament to take over the monarchy of Great Britain. So he was still a German prince. So these are kind of his guys too, even though, had to pony up the money for him.
Hey
Uh,
Jim,
yeah,
we have a question in the chat. Sorry, I I don't know if you all could hear me earlier. The question is, was the theory of revolution used by the Confederate government to secede from the United States during the Civil War?
The Confederate States of America took a lot from the Declaration of Independence and from this period. And partly it's because they had to do it quickly. It was kind of ready-made. And partly it was hearkening back to this particular period and saying, look, we're really no different from the 13 colonies, except now there are what, seven of us? And we're doing the same sort of thing. So that was no accident. I hope that answers the question. Again, always the same caveat. I forgot to give at the beginning. I'm an archaeologist. I'm not an historian. Uh, I happen to do historical archaeology, so I have some familiarity with some of this. Oops. He is, he talks about he has excited domestic insurrections. He's talked about the loyalists, and also trying to goad the Native Americans, particularly the various uh, Iroquois nations, into attacking the colonies, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That pretty well describes all out warfare uh, developed by Europeans. And now the summation of the prosecution against the king. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Remember, the most recent being just a year ago at the Olive Branch petition. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. That's summing up the prosecution. And you'll notice through all this, the word tyrant shows up, but there's no mention of the king enslaving the colonists. Slavery is not part of they changed the words. And it came to be about tyranny and not about enslavement. Again, this is probably the Southern contingent influencing what was written. And they also had this penultimate paragraph, a summary of the prosecution against the people of England, because they'd been telling folks back home, if you will, back in Great Britain, that what was being done to us could be done to them too. So here they address that. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too, the English people, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which demonstrates our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. And you have to remember, they are related. They have relatives back there. If there's going to be war, and there is war, there's been war going on for a year at this point, a little over a year, they're fighting their brothers, metaphorically speaking. The final paragraph, is the actual Declaration of Independence. This is the Declaration. Everything else is kind of laying out, all the reasoning, the theory, and everything. This is a declaration. It's about 158 words, as I recall. And again, you'll notice that first sentence, united, is spelt with a small u, not a capital U. And it has to do with how they perceive, as you'll see as we get to the end of the paragraph, how they perceive themselves. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This is a powerful paragraph. And there's a lot of stuff going on with words which kind of touch on current politics today, how people manipulate through their choice of words. Um, it's the state of Great Britain, not the British Empire. By calling it the state of Great Britain, they're putting themselves on an equal footing because they too are independent states. And they do refer to free and independent states. They really see themselves as 13 essentially individual countries. They do not see themselves as a country. They see themselves as uniting for a particular purpose, which is to uh, truly have their independence from Great Britain. And so it's sort of it's an alliance. This is not the United States of America with a capital U. This is the states of America that happen to be united in this particular uh, effort. And that's why they say as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, do alliances, commerce, and all these other things. Each of them could do those things themselves without reference to the others. And so just as sort of a little kind of two bits I wanted to add at the end that aren't, terrible. Well, I mean, they're related, but this quote from John Adams from 1765, so 11 years before the Declaration. Rulers are no more than attorneys, agents, and trustees for the people. And if the cause, interest, and trust is insidiously betrayed or wantonly trifled away, the people have to revoke the authority that they themselves deputed and constitute abler and better agents, attorneys, and trustees. This is a lawyer's argument. And this is again, it gets back to the government as a trust instrumentality of the people. It's something the people create to affect certain ends. And if it doesn't do the job, they have the right to do a do-over. And then finally, I couldn't find the picture I was really interested in, but this is a chamber pot with the royal seal of King George on the side of it. I've seen them. There are tin glazed earthenware chamber pots with a portrait of King George in the bottom inside, and it'll say, GR number 3. So this is where we got to from uh, July 1775, blaming the ministers and pledging obsequiously loyalty and love of King to King George. Your face belongs under our butt. Anyway, that's all I've got for this. Um, so we have 10 minutes, but before I open it up to questions, I do want to point out that this is kind of laying the groundwork for the series I want to start in September, which is on the road to nationhood, which is really about the Constitution. Because right now, Declaration, we have a bunch of 13 independent countries with an alliance that we call the Articles of Confederation. And so in the fall, I want to explore those Articles of Confederation and then eventually the Constitution. So that's all I have to say. Ask away.
Okay, so it says, what elements, if any, of the Declaration of Independence was adopted immediately after the French Revolution before Napoleon declared himself emperor/dictator?
Well, the Declaration was a done deal about 13 years before the French Revolution. The French who helped us, I mean, without the French, we would have had a great deal of difficulty winning our independence. They provided enormous military support, weapons, funding, so much so they drove themselves into bankruptcy, which led to their own revolution. But the French drew heavily from our Declaration of Independence. I'm not a French historian by any means, so I don't know how carefully they looked at developments during the New Republic. After we'd gotten independence, how carefully were they looking at us and uh, drawing on our experience? But that said, Thomas Jefferson, we had ambassadors in France, high-profile ambassadors. So certainly the leadership in France knew what was going on. Whether the rebels in the French Revolution knew what was going on, I couldn't say. Anything else? So
Wondering if you ever worked on any Revolutionary era archaeological sites in the Northeast.
I won't say I worked on it per se. My undergraduate professor on our way up to northern New Hampshire worked on a Native American site. We stopped at Mount Independence, which is across the Hudson from Ticonderoga. And we basically picked up artifacts. We were pot hunting. I think that I don't consider myself a military archaeologist. I'm never really very interested in military archaeology, but I don't think I've ever worked on a Revolutionary War cantonment or a battlefield or anything. I worked on the site of a Patriot down North Carolina in not Durham, in Greensboro, Thomas Caldwell Log College, a minister, Protestant minister, uh, terribly anti-Catholic. Um, but in excavating, we found a pair of these glass insets that would have gone into cufflinks.
Hmm,
And on the back of them, the negative was embossed Liberty. And so when these stones, if you will, were set into the cufflinks, you would see Liberty.
that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, but other than that, yeah, one of the problems in looking at celebrating the American Revolution from an archaeological perspective in Maryland is that not much has happened here. We were not on the battle lines. It kind of went around us. It was up north, Massachusetts, and then New York and New Jersey. They kind of skirted around Oceanside to North Carolina and then Virginia. Um, Mostly what we did, apart from providing the Maryland, was it the Flying Line or whatever it's called, those 400 who protected Washington's rear end in the Battle of Brooklyn. Most of what we did was supply the army, uh, beef, grains, etc. Okay, any other questions? Because I think we may be getting, oh, we have 5 minutes. She can't give us the bum's rush yet. No, I hope to see all of you in September.